you don't have anything on me. This whole trial is a joke." 17-year-old Brandon Hayes stood before Judge Elizabeth Warren in a Florida courtroom on a March afternoon in 2022, smirking as he addressed the court during a hearing to determine if there was sufficient evidence to proceed with his trial for vehicular homicide and leaving the scene of an accident. Brandon's attorney had just argued that without physical evidence directly linking Brandon to the hit-and-run that had killed 16-year-old Emma Rodriguez, the case should be dismissed. Brandon, confident that he had successfully disposed of evidence and believing his younger brother Noah would never betray family loyalty, had become increasingly brazen in his courtroom behavior, rolling his eyes during witness testimony, whispering jokes to his attorney, and now openly mocking the proceedings. But what Brandon didn't know was that his 15-year-old brother Noah had been sitting in the gallery wrestling with his conscience for weeks, carrying evidence that would prove Brandon's guilt, and struggling with the terrible choice between family loyalty and doing what was right. As Judge Warren began to address the sufficiency of evidence, Noah stood up, his hands shaking as he held his phone aloft. "I have evidence," the teenager said, his voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to stop all proceedings. "I have text messages and videos that prove my brother did it. I can't let him get away with killing Emma. I just can't." The courtroom erupted. Brandon's smirk vanished, replaced by shock and then rage as he realized his younger brother was about to destroy his defense. This moment, when family loyalty collided with moral obligation, when a teenager's arrogance met his undoing through his own brother's conscience, would become one of the most dramatic courtroom revelations in recent Florida legal history. Before we continue with this complex and ethically challenging case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we explore this case of vehicular homicide, a defendant's arrogance, and the moral courage of a younger brother who chose justice over family loyalty. The city of Clearwater, Florida, population approximately 115,000, sits on the Gulf Coast of Central Florida, known for its beautiful beaches, tourism industry, and suburban communities that serve as bedroom communities for Tampa. Clearwater represented a mix of longtime Florida residents and transplants seeking the state's warm climate and coastal lifestyle. The city's demographics were diverse, its economy centered on tourism and service industries, and its schools served a mix of students from various socioeconomic backgrounds. It was a place where high school students cruised the coastal roads on weekend nights, where beach parties were common, and where the dangers of distracted and reckless driving had tragically claimed too many young lives. The Hayes family had lived in Clearwater for 8 years, having moved from Ohio when the boy's father, Michael Hayes, had taken a position managing a resort property on Clearwater Beach. The family, Michael, his wife Jennifer, and their sons Brandon, 17, and Noah, 15, had built what appeared from the outside to be a comfortable upper-middle-class life. However, as would become clear during investigation and trial, the family dynamics were more complicated than appearances suggested, with Brandon having been given few boundaries or consequences throughout his childhood, and Noah having developed a strong sense of right and wrong that would ultimately conflict with family loyalty. Emma Grace Rodriguez was 16 years old when Brandon Hayes struck her with his car and left her to die on the side of the road on the night of October 23, 2021. A junior at Clearwater High School, Emma represented the kind of bright, engaged teenager who had her whole future ahead of her. With a 3.9 GPA, participation in the school's environmental club and soccer team, and a passion for marine biology that she hoped to pursue in college, Emma had been exactly the kind of student that teachers loved having in class and that peers respected for her combination of intelligence and kindness. Emma's personality was described consistently by friends, teachers, and family members as genuinely compassionate, hard-working, and possessed of an infectious enthusiasm for life and learning. Her AP biology teacher, Mr. David Chen, would later testify that Emma had been one of the most intellectually curious students he had taught in 15 years. Someone who asked questions because she genuinely wanted to understand complex concepts rather than simply to achieve good grades. Her soccer coach described her as a team player who elevated those around her through her positive attitude and work ethic. Beyond her academic achievements and extracurricular activities, Emma had been a devoted daughter to her parents, Carlos and Maria Rodriguez, and a loving older sister to her two younger siblings. Carlos worked as a mechanic at a local automotive shop, while Maria worked as a teacher's aide at an elementary school. The Rodriguez family, while not wealthy, had created a warm, supportive home environment where education was valued and where hard work was expected and celebrated. Emma's relationship with her parents had been particularly close, with regular family dinners where everyone shared their days, weekend outings to the beach, and long conversations about Emma's dreams and plans for the future. She had been planning to apply to the University of Florida and Florida State University, hoping to study marine biology and eventually work in ocean conservation. Her bedroom was decorated with posters of sea turtles and coral reefs, her bookshelf filled with books about ocean ecosystems, her desk covered with college brochures and scholarship applications. In the weeks before her death, Emma had been especially excited about a research project she was conducting on the impact of red tide on local marine life. She had spent hours at the beach collecting samples, had been corresponding with a marine biologist at a local research institute, and had been planning to present her findings at a regional science fair. Friends who knew her well described her as being in one of the happiest periods of her life, doing well in school, enjoying soccer season, feeling confident about her college applications, and optimistic about her future. The night of October 23, 2021, was a Saturday, and Emma had attended a school soccer game where her team had won their quarterfinal playoff match. After the game, Emma and several teammates had gone to a local restaurant to celebrate before Emma had texted her parents around 10:30 p.m. to let them know she was heading home. The route from the restaurant to the Rodriguez home took Emma along Gulf to Bay Boulevard, a well-lit four-lane road that was typically busy with traffic even on weekend evenings. What occurred on Gulf to Bay Boulevard at approximately 10:47 p.m. on October 23, 2021, would be reconstructed through witness testimony, forensic evidence, surveillance footage from nearby businesses, and, ultimately, through evidence provided by Noah Hayes that would prove his brother's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The sequence of events revealed a hit-and-run that was not merely an accident, but a crime compounded by Brandon's decision to flee, to destroy evidence and to lie about his involvement while an innocent girl died alone on the roadside. Emma had been riding her bicycle in the designated bike lane on Gulf to Bay Boulevard, wearing reflective clothing and with lights on her bike as required by law. She was an experienced cyclist who regularly rode to and from school and activities, and she followed traffic laws carefully. According to witness testimony and forensic reconstruction, Emma had been riding properly in the bike lane, visible to any attentive driver, when Brandon Hayes struck her from behind while driving his parents' BMW sedan at approximately 60 miles per hour in a 40 mph zone. The impact, as forensic analysis would later show, had been catastrophic. Emma had been thrown from her bicycle, had landed on the roadway, and had sustained massive head trauma along with multiple broken bones. The medical examiner would later testify that while the initial impact had caused severe injuries, Emma had likely survived for at least several minutes after being struck, meaning that if Brandon had stopped and called for emergency help immediately, she might have survived. But Brandon did not stop. Despite the obvious impact the sound of striking Emma and her bicycle, the damage to his vehicle's front end and windshield, Brandon had made the conscious decision to flee the scene. Surveillance footage from a business near the scene would later show Brandon's BMW speeding away from the area within seconds of the impact, not even slowing down to assess the damage or to check on his victim. Emma had been discovered approximately 8 minutes after the impact by a passing motorist who called 911. Paramedics arrived quickly and transported Emma to Bayfront Health, St. Petersburg, but she had succumbed to her injuries shortly after arrival, never regaining consciousness. The medical examiner would later testify that the delay in receiving medical care had significantly decreased Emma's chances of survival, and that immediate emergency response might have saved her life. The investigation that followed combined traditional detective work with modern forensic techniques and would eventually build a circumstantial case against Brandon Hayes even before Noah's dramatic revelation provided direct evidence. Detective Michelle Torres of the Clearwater Police Department, the lead investigator assigned to the case, had immediately recognized that the hit-and-run showed signs of high-speed impact, and that the driver would have known they struck something substantial. The crime scene investigation documented debris from the vehicle that struck Emma, including fragments of a headlight assembly, pieces of a side mirror, and paint chips. Forensic analysis of these fragments revealed they came from a BMW sedan, likely a model year between 2018 and 2020, and the paint color matched BMW's designation Alpine White. This information allowed investigators to narrow their search to BMWs in the area matching this description. Additionally, surveillance footage from businesses along Gulf to Bay Boulevard provided crucial evidence. While no camera had captured the actual impact, footage from a gas station approximately half a mile from the scene showed a white BMW sedan with front-end damage and a missing side mirror passing by at 10:49 p.m., just 2 minutes after the estimated time of impact. The footage, while not clear enough to show the license plate, captured enough details of the vehicle to confirm it matched the debris found at the scene. Detective Torres began canvassing auto body shops and dealerships in the area, looking for anyone who had brought in a white BMW for front-end collision repair. She also ran DMV records for registered BMWs, matching the description within a 50-mile radius of Clearwater. The Hayes family's 2019 BMW sedan appeared on that list, and when Torres drove by the Hayes residence on October 25th, 2 days after the hit and run, she noted that the BMW was parked in the garage, but that the garage door had been left partially open, allowing her to see that the vehicle's front end appeared to be covered with a tarp. Based on these observations and the vehicle's match to the description from the crime scene evidence, Torres obtained a search warrant for the Hayes residence and vehicle. The execution of that warrant on October 26th would provide crucial evidence, even as it also revealed the sophistication of Brandon's attempts to destroy evidence of his crime. When investigators arrived with the search warrant, Michael and Jennifer Hayes were shocked and insisted there must be some mistake their BMW had been in their garage for several days, having been driven by Jennifer for routine errands but not involved in any accident. However, when the tarp was removed from the vehicle's front end, significant damage was immediately apparent. A cracked windshield, front bumper damage, a missing side mirror, and damage to the hood and grille consistent with striking a person on a bicycle. Most significantly, traces of what appeared to be blood were visible in the damage areas, despite apparent attempts to clean the vehicle. Forensic examination would later confirm that this blood matched Emma Rodriguez's DNA profile. The BMW's event data recorder, the automotive equivalent of a black box, showed that the vehicle had been traveling at 60 mph at the time of impact on October 23rd at approximately 10:47 p.m., and that the driver had not applied the brakes before or immediately after impact. When confronted with this evidence, Michael and Jennifer Hayes were devastated. Michael stated that he had been out of town on business on October 23rd, and Jennifer stated that she had been home that evening, but had gone to bed early and had not heard Brandon come home. When asked where Brandon had been that night, Jennifer said Brandon had told her he had been at a friend's house and had come home around midnight, and that she had not noticed any damage to the car the following day. Brandon, when questioned by Detective Torres with his parents and attorney present, had immediately denied any involvement in the hit and run. He claimed he had been at his friend Lucas Martinez's house all evening on October 23rd, that he had not driven the BMW that night, and that he had no idea how the car had been damaged. He suggested that perhaps his mother had hit something without realizing it, or that someone had damaged the car while it was parked. This initial statement would prove to be the first of many lies Brandon would tell in his attempts to avoid responsibility for Emma's death. Over the following weeks, as forensic evidence continued to mount, Brandon's story would evolve in ways that demonstrated consciousness of guilt, while his public attitude became increasingly arrogant as he convinced himself the circumstantial evidence wouldn't be sufficient for conviction. The forensic evidence collected from the BMW proved overwhelming. In addition to Emma's blood on the damaged front end, investigators found fibers from Emma's reflective vest embedded in the damaged grille paint transfer from Emma's bicycle on the BMW's bumper. A small piece of Emma's bicycle handlebar grip wedged in the wheel well GPS data from the BMW's navigation system, showing the vehicle was on Gulf to Bay Boulevard at the time of the incident. Additionally, analysis of Brandon's phone showed that while he had initially claimed to have been at Lucas's house, his phone's GPS data placed him on Gulf to Bay Boulevard at 10:47 p.m., the exact time and location of the hit and run. When confronted with this phone location data, Brandon changed his story. He now claimed that, yes, he had driven past that area that night, but that was on his way to Lucas's house and he had not been involved in any accident. He suggested that the phone location data must have been wrong about the time, or that he had driven by before the accident occurred. Lucas Martinez, when interviewed by police, contradicted Brandon's alibi. Lucas stated that Brandon had called him around 11:15 p.m. on October 23rd, asking if he could say Brandon had been at his house all evening. Lucas, uncomfortable with lying to police, had declined. However, he noted that Brandon had been extremely agitated during the call and had specifically mentioned needing an alibi for around 10:45 p.m. This evidence of Brandon attempting to create a false alibi, combined with the physical and digital evidence, led to Brandon's arrest on October 30th, 2021, 1 week after Emma's death. He was charged as an adult. He had turned 17 3 months before the incident with vehicular homicide, leaving the scene of an accident involving death and tampering with evidence. He was released on $100,000 bond posted by his parents, with conditions including surrender of his driver's license, electronic monitoring, and prohibition from leaving the county. The evidence against Brandon appeared strong, but prosecutors recognized that it was largely circumstantial. While Brandon's phone placed him at the scene, his phone data placing him at that exact location at that exact time. The physical evidence from his vehicle and his attempts to create an alibi all pointed to his guilt. There was no direct evidence, such as a witness who saw him driving or a confession. This gap in the evidence would become the foundation of Brandon's defense strategy and the source of his growing arrogance as the case proceeded toward trial. Brandon James Hayes was 17 years old when he killed Emma Rodriguez and fled the scene, making decisions that would define the rest of his life. As the older of 2 sons in an affluent family, Brandon had grown up with significant privileges and, according to those who knew the family, with insufficient boundaries or consequences for his actions. Teachers and coaches described Brandon as intelligent but lazy, someone who coasted on natural ability rather than working hard, and someone who reacted poorly to criticism or accountability. School records that became evidence during proceedings documented concerning behavior throughout Brandon's academic career. He had been suspended twice in high school, once for cheating on an exam and once for reckless driving in the school parking lot that nearly caused an accident. In both cases, according to school administrators, Michael and Jennifer Hayes had minimized their son's behavior and had focused more on defending him than on addressing the underlying problems. Most significantly, Brandon had a history of traffic violations that should have resulted in loss of driving privileges. He had received 3 speeding tickets in the 18 months before Emma's death, including one for driving 75 km in a 45 mph zone. He had also been involved in a minor accident where he rear-ended another vehicle while texting and driving. In each case, his parents had paid the fines and had hired attorneys to minimize the impact on Brandon's driving record, preventing the accumulation of points that would have resulted in license suspension. Friends who knew Brandon described a pattern of behavior showing entitlement and lack of empathy. Multiple classmates would testify that Brandon frequently bragged about getting away with things, that he drove recklessly with passengers who were afraid to speak up, and that he showed little concern for how his actions affected others. One particularly telling incident from his junior year involved Brandon posting video on social media of himself street racing with another student, captioned, "Cops can't catch me." This pattern of risky behavior, combined with his parents' history of protecting him from consequences, had created a perfect storm for tragedy. Brandon had learned that he could break rules without facing serious consequences, that his parents would intervene to protect him, and that his charm and his family's resources could get him out of trouble. This mindset would prove deadly when he struck Emma Rodriguez, and would later manifest in his courtroom behavior as he convinced himself he would beat the charges against him. The relationship between Brandon and his younger brother Noah was complex and would become central to understanding the case's dramatic conclusion. Noah Hayes was 15 years old, a freshman at Clearwater High School, and in many ways Brandon's opposite. Where Brandon was outgoing and arrogant, Noah was quiet and thoughtful. Where Brandon coasted through school with minimal effort, Noah worked hard to achieve strong grades. Where Brandon seemed to lack empathy, Noah was described by teachers and friends as unusually compassionate for his age. Friends who knew both brothers described a relationship that had become increasingly strained as they grew older. As children, they had been relatively close, but as Brandon entered high school and his behavior became more problematic, Noah had become less comfortable with his brother's choices. Multiple people would later report that Noah had been embarrassed by Brandon's behavior, had expressed concern to friends about Brandon's driving, and had stopped riding in cars with Brandon after a particularly scary incident where Brandon had driven recklessly with Noah as a passenger. Most significantly for the case, Noah had been home on the night of October 23, 2021, and had witnessed events that would prove crucial to establishing Brandon's guilt. According to Noah's later testimony, he had been in his bedroom doing homework when he heard Brandon's BMW pull into the garage around 11 p.m. Noah had heard sounds suggesting Brandon was upset doors slamming, Brandon cursing, and had gotten up to see if his brother was okay. What Noah witnessed through the crack in his bedroom door would haunt him for months. He had seen Brandon come into the house, clearly agitated, and had watched as Brandon went immediately to the garage. Noah had quietly followed and had watched from the doorway as Brandon examined the front end of the BMW, noting the damage and the crack in the windshield. Noah had heard Brandon talking to himself. Shit, shit, shit. Okay, think. Just stay calm. Nobody saw anything. The bike doesn't have a camera. Just clean it up and stick to the story. Noah had then watched as Brandon retrieved cleaning supplies and spent the next hour attempting to clean blood and debris from the BMW's damaged front end. Noah had been confused about what was happening. Why would there be blood on the car? What had Brandon hit? Where was Brandon when this happened? But fear of confronting his brother and uncertainty about what he was witnessing had kept Noah silent. The following day, when news broke about the hit-and-run that had killed Emma Rodriguez, Noah had begun to suspect the connection. When he learned that Emma had been struck on Gulf to Bay Boulevard at approximately 10:47 p.m., And when he thought about the timeline of Brandon arriving home upset around 11:00 p.m., the pieces fell together in a way that made Noah physically ill. His brother had killed someone. His brother had hit a girl on a bike and had left her to die while he came home and cleaned the car to hide evidence. But Noah had said nothing. He was 15 years old, terrified of his brother's reaction if he spoke up, worried about what revelation would do to his family, and uncertain whether what he had witnessed was enough to prove anything. He rationalized his silence by telling himself that maybe he was wrong. Maybe Brandon hadn't been involved. Maybe the damage to the car was from something else. This rationalization became harder to maintain after Brandon was arrested on October 30th. Noah knew then that his suspicions had been correct, but he still remained silent, trapped by the terrible dilemma of family loyalty versus moral obligation. His parents, devastated by Brandon's arrest, had asked both sons to support their brother and to trust that the truth would come out. But Noah knew the truth. He had watched Brandon clean blood from the car, had heard Brandon talking about sticking to his story, had witnessed the immediate aftermath of the crime. What finally pushed Noah to come forward was a combination of factors that built over the months between Brandon's arrest and the beginning of trial. First, Noah had learned more about Emma Rodriguez, her academic achievements, her dreams of becoming a marine biologist, her close relationship with her family, the fact that she and Noah had shared AP biology class though he hadn't known her well, the realization that Emma was a real person with a real family and real dreams that had been destroyed made staying silent increasingly unbearable. Second, Noah had witnessed his brother's behavior becoming increasingly arrogant as the months passed. Rather than showing remorse or taking responsibility, Brandon had become confident that he would beat the charges. He bragged to Noah about how the prosecution's case was weak, how they didn't have any real proof he had been driving, how he would walk away from this. This arrogance, the complete absence of remorse for Emma's death, made Noah realize that his brother had learned nothing and would likely hurt someone else if he got away with this. Third, and most powerfully, Noah had met Emma's family at a community memorial service held 6 weeks after her death. He had gone without telling his parents, driven by a need to understand who Emma had been and to somehow honor her memory. At the memorial, he had heard Emma's parents speak about their daughter, had heard her younger siblings cry for their sister, had seen the devastating impact of Emma's death on her family and community. Carlos Rodriguez had spoken about how Emma had been planning to apply to the University of Florida, about how she had dreams of protecting ocean ecosystems, about how the family would never be the same without her. Noah had left that memorial service knowing he couldn't stay silent any longer. Emma's family deserved justice. Emma's death deserved truth. And if Noah's silence allowed Brandon to avoid consequences for taking Emma's life, Noah would be complicit in that injustice. But the decision to come forward was agonizing. Noah spent weeks wrestling with the implications. He confided in his youth pastor, who encouraged him to speak the truth but acknowledged the difficulty of the decision. He wrote pages in his journal trying to process the conflict between family loyalty and moral obligation. He barely slept, replaying the night of October 23rd in his mind and imagining Emma's final moments, wondering if she had been conscious after the impact, wondering if she'd been scared and in pain while Brandon was at home cleaning the car. One entry in Noah's journal, written in February 2022, captured his anguish. "I don't know what to do. If I tell what I saw, I'll destroy my family. Mom and Dad will never forgive me for testifying against Brandon. Brandon will hate me forever. Everyone will call me a traitor. But if I stay quiet, Emma's family never gets justice. Brandon gets away with killing someone. And I have to live knowing I could have spoken up but didn't because I was scared. I think about Emma every day. I think about her family. I think about what kind of person I want to be. And I know that being a good person means telling the truth even when it costs you everything." Noah had made his decision by early March 2022, as Brandon's trial date approached. He had contacted the prosecutor's office through an anonymous tip line, saying he had information about the Hayes case. When Detective Torres had followed up, Noah had asked to meet somewhere away from his home, and had broken down crying as he explained what he had witnessed, and the evidence he had. The evidence Noah provided was more comprehensive than even he had initially realized. In the weeks after October 23rd, Noah had begun documenting his brother's statements and behavior, partly as a way to process what was happening, and partly because he had sensed that eventually he might need proof of what he was witnessing. His phone contained text messages between Brandon and friends where Brandon joked about the charges against him, including one message that said, "They can't prove shit because I didn't leave any witnesses alive," followed by a laughing emoji. A video Noah had surreptitiously recorded of Brandon talking to a friend about the night of October 23rd, where Brandon described driving fast on Gulf to Bay because he was late, saying he didn't see the bike until it was too late, but that he had to get out of there before anyone saw. Photos Noah had taken of the BMW's interior the day after the hit and run, showing blood on the steering wheel and dashboard that Brandon had missed during his initial cleaning. Detailed written notes Noah had made of Brandon's cleaning the car on the night of October 23rd, including exact times and descriptions of what he observed. Most damning was the video of Brandon admitting he had struck Emma, that he had seen her bike too late, but that he had fled because he panicked. This admission, made to a friend Brandon trusted about 3 weeks after the incident, directly contradicted Brandon's claims of innocence and provided the direct evidence prosecutors had been lacking. Prosecutor Catherine Morrison, reviewing Noah's evidence, recognized that it would transform their case from circumstantial to conclusive. She also recognized the enormous courage it took for a 15-year-old to come forward with evidence against his own brother, knowing it would tear his family apart. Morrison handled Noah with great care, ensuring he received counseling support and protection from retaliation, and preparing him for the difficulty of what would come. The decision about when and how to present Noah's evidence became strategic. Morrison decided not to inform the defense about Noah's testimony until legally required, meaning Brandon and his attorneys wouldn't know about this evidence until shortly before trial. This decision was partially tactical, preventing the defense from developing arguments against the evidence, but also partially protective of Noah. delaying the moment when his family would learn of his decision to testify. The trial of State of Florida versus Brandon Hayes began on March 14, 2022, in Pinellas County Circuit Court before Judge Elizabeth Warren. The case had attracted significant local media attention given the tragedy of Emma's death and the broader community concern about hit-and-run accidents and accountability for reckless driving. The courtroom was filled daily with Emma's family and supporters, with members of the local cycling community who had organized in Emma's memory, and with community members who had followed the case. Jury selection proved challenging, with potential jurors expressing difficulty remaining objective about a case involving a teenage girl killed by a hit-and-run driver. Many potential jurors had strong feelings about reckless driving, or knew someone who had been affected by similar crashes. After 1 week of careful examination, a jury of 7 women and 5 men was seated, all of whom had affirmed their ability to consider the evidence fairly despite the case's emotional difficulty. Lead prosecutor Catherine Morrison opened the trial by immediately establishing Emma's humanity and Brandon's responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about choices. Emma Rodriguez made good choices on the night of October 23, 2021. She wore reflective clothing. She had lights on her bike. She rode in the bike lane. She followed every rule designed to keep cyclists safe. Brandon Hayes made bad choices. He drove 20 miles over the speed limit on a busy road. He wasn't paying attention to the road. And when he struck Emma Rodriguez and left her dying on the roadside, he made the worst choice of all. He chose to flee, to cover up his crime, and to lie about his involvement while Emma's family suffered without answers. Morrison displayed photographs of Emma on the courtroom screen smiling in her school photo, in her soccer uniform with her family. Emma Rodriguez was 16 years old. She had dreams of becoming a marine biologist, of protecting ocean ecosystems, of making a positive impact on the world. Brandon Hayes took all of that away in a moment of reckless driving, and then compounded that tragedy by fleeing and lying. The evidence will show you beyond reasonable doubt that Brandon Hayes killed Emma Rodriguez, and that he did everything in his power to avoid being held accountable for her death. Defense attorney Marcus Webb faced the challenge of defending a client against what appeared to be strong circumstantial evidence, while knowing nothing of the direct evidence prosecution had yet to reveal. Webb's opening strategy focused on attacking the circumstantial nature of the evidence and creating reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, the prosecution wants you to believe that they have proven beyond reasonable doubt that Brandon Hayes was driving the vehicle that struck Emma Rodriguez. But what they actually have is a series of assumptions and circumstantial evidence. Yes, the Hayes family vehicle was involved in an accident. But can they prove Brandon was driving? Can they prove he knew he had struck a person? Can they prove he intentionally fled rather than simply panicking as a young driver might do? The prosecution's case is built on inference rather than proof, and inference is not enough to convict a 17-year-old boy of a crime that will follow him for the rest of his life. This defense strategy acknowledging the vehicle was involved, but questioning whether they could prove Brandon was driving, and whether he knew he had struck a person was the best approach given the evidence Webb knew about. However, it would prove inadequate once Noah's testimony was introduced. The prosecution's case unfolded over the first week of trial, with witnesses and evidence creating a comprehensive portrait of the hit and run, the investigation, and the mounting evidence against Brandon. The testimony began with Emma's family and friends, who described her character, her activities on the night of October 23rd, and the devastating impact of her death. Carlos Rodriguez, Emma's father, provided heartbreaking testimony about his daughter's dreams and the permanent void her death had created. Emma wanted to save the oceans. Carlos testified through tears. She spent hours at the beach studying tide pools, collecting samples, learning everything she could about marine ecosystems. She had applications to universities. She had plans. She had a future. And then in one moment, a careless driver took all of that away. Not only did he take her life, but he didn't even stop to help her. He left her alone on the side of the road to die. That's what haunts me most, that she might have been conscious, might have been scared and in pain, and no one was there because the person who hit her chose to run. This testimony established the human cost of Brandon's actions and set the emotional tone for the case. Other witnesses described the immediate aftermath of the accident, the discovery of Emma's body, and the unsuccessful attempts to save her life. The forensic evidence presentation provided clinical but powerful testimony about the crash dynamics and the evidence linking the Hayes' BMW to the scene. Accident reconstruction expert Dr. James Wilson testified that based on the damage patterns, the bicycle debris, and the physical evidence, Emma had been struck from behind by a vehicle traveling approximately 60 mph. He explained that at that speed, any attentive driver would have seen the bicycle's lights and reflective elements with sufficient time to avoid a collision. The bike lane on Gulf to Bay Boulevard is well marked and adequately lit, Dr. Wilson testified. Emma Rodriguez was wearing reflective clothing, and her bicycle had both front and rear lights in working order. She was visible to any driver paying attention to the road. The fact that the striking vehicle did not brake before impact suggests the driver was distracted, impaired, or simply not watching the road. Forensic testimony about the evidence collected from the BMW provided overwhelming proof that this vehicle had struck Emma. DNA analysis confirmed that Emma's blood was on the vehicle. Fiber analysis confirmed that fibers from her reflective vest were embedded in the grille. Paint transfer analysis confirmed that paint from her bicycle was on the BMW's bumper. Every piece of physical evidence connected this specific vehicle to this specific victim. The testimony about Brandon's phone location data provided crucial evidence placing him at the scene. Digital forensics expert Rebecca Martinez testified that Brandon's phone GPS data showed he was on Gulf to Bay Boulevard at 10:47 p.m. on October 23rd, the exact time and location where Emma was struck. She explained that modern smartphones constantly record location data that can be extracted through forensic analysis, and that this data was highly reliable. Brandon Hayes' phone was at the scene of the hit and run at the exact time it occurred, Martinez testified. The GPS coordinates place him within 50 feet of the impact location at 10:47 p.m. This is not a coincidence. This is direct evidence that Brandon Hayes was present when Emma Rodriguez was struck. The testimony about Brandon's attempts to create a false alibi provided evidence of consciousness of guilt. Lucas Martinez testified about receiving a call from Brandon late on the night of October 23rd, asking him to lie to police about Brandon's whereabouts. Brandon called me around 11:15 and asked if I would say he was at my house all evening, Lucas testified. He specifically mentioned needing an alibi for around 10:45. I told him I couldn't lie to the police. He got angry and hung up. The next day, when I heard about the hit and run, I realized why he needed that alibi. This testimony established that Brandon had immediately recognized he needed to cover up his whereabouts, demonstrating that he knew he had done something requiring an alibi. By the end of the first week of testimony, the prosecution had built a strong circumstantial case. However, defense attorney Webb had been effective in cross-examination, emphasizing that while the evidence showed the Hayes vehicle was involved and that Brandon's phone was at the scene, it didn't definitively prove Brandon was driving, or that he knew he had struck a person rather than merely an object in the road. Throughout this first week of testimony, Brandon's behavior in the courtroom had become increasingly concerning. Rather than showing appropriate seriousness about proceedings that would determine whether he spent years in prison, Brandon had displayed arrogance and indifference. He had been observed smirking during some testimony, rolling his eyes when witnesses described the evidence against him, and whispering what appeared to be jokes to his attorney during breaks. His body language suggested he believed he would be acquitted, that the circumstantial evidence wouldn't be enough for conviction. This arrogance reached its peak during a Friday afternoon hearing at the end of the first week, when defense attorney Webb had moved to dismiss the charges for insufficient evidence. Judge Warren had called a hearing to address this motion, and during the proceedings, Brandon had become visibly confident, almost cocky in his demeanor. When Judge Warren asked if the defense had anything to add beyond their written motion, Brandon had actually stood without his attorney's permission and addressed the court directly. "Your Honor, this whole trial has been a waste of time," Brandon said, his tone disrespectful and dismissive. "The prosecution doesn't have any real proof I did anything. They have a car that was in an accident, and some phone data that just shows I drove down the same road as thousands of other people that night. You don't have witnesses. You don't have video of me driving. You don't have a confession. You don't have anything real. This whole trial is a joke, and we all know it." The courtroom had erupted at this outburst. Judge Warren had immediately ordered Brandon to sit down and be quiet, warning him about contempt of court. Webb had apologized profusely for his client's behavior. Emma's family had reacted with visible anger at Brandon's dismissive attitude toward their daughter's death. But Brandon's statement, his arrogant confidence that the evidence was insufficient, would prove to be the moment that sealed his fate. Because sitting in the gallery, having attended every day of the trial, was Noah Hayes, and Noah had heard enough. As Judge Warren began to respond to Brandon's outburst and to address the sufficiency of evidence, Noah stood up from his seat in the back of the courtroom. His hands were shaking as he raised them, holding his phone. His voice was quiet but clear enough to cut through the murmur of the courtroom in the moment of relative silence after Brandon's outburst. "I have evidence," Noah said. All eyes turned to the teenage boy standing in the gallery. "I have text messages and videos that prove my brother did it. I can't let him get away with killing Emma. I just can't." The courtroom froze. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, everyone processing what had just been said. Then everything happened at once. Brandon's face transformed from arrogance to shock to rage in seconds. He turned in his seat, staring at his brother with an expression of such fury and betrayal that bailiffs immediately moved toward him. "Noah, what the fuck are you doing?" Brandon shouted, before his attorney grabbed his arm and told him to be quiet. Michael and Jennifer Hayes, sitting behind their older son, looked back at Noah with expressions of disbelief and hurt. Jennifer started crying immediately. Michael stood as if to approach Noah, but was waved back down by bailiffs. Judge Warren, recovering from her own surprise, gavelled for order and instructed Noah to approach the bench. Prosecutor Morrison, who had been waiting for the right moment to introduce Noah's testimony and recognized that this was it, stood and explained. "Your Honor, Noah Hayes contacted our office several weeks ago with evidence relevant to this case. We have interviewed him extensively, have reviewed the evidence he has provided, and were planning to call him as a witness. His timing in speaking up is perhaps not what we would have planned, but his evidence is directly relevant to the motion before the court." What followed was a series of emergency conferences, recesses, and legal arguments that consumed the remainder of Friday and extended into Monday as the court addressed the bombshell of Noah's testimony. Brandon's attorneys argued that Noah's evidence should be excluded on various grounds that he was biased against his brother, that evidence obtained through family communications might be privileged, that the prosecution had violated discovery rules by not revealing this earlier. Judge Warren ultimately ruled that Noah's testimony and evidence were admissible. She noted that while the timing was unusual, there was no legal basis to exclude testimony from a fact witness simply because he was the defendant's brother, that the evidence Noah possessed had been gathered through his own observations rather than privileged communications, and that the prosecution had complied with discovery rules by providing notice as required. When trial resumed on Tuesday morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Brandon's earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by visible anxiety and anger. His parents looked devastated. Emma's family looked hopeful that finally they would get the direct evidence needed to ensure justice. The media presence had intensified as word spread about the dramatic turn the case had taken. Noah Hayes took the witness stand looking terrified but determined. At 15 years old, wearing dress clothes that seemed too formal for his age, he appeared small and vulnerable in the witness chair. Prosecutor Morrison approached him gently, establishing basic background before moving to the critical testimony. "Noah, can you tell the jury where you were on the evening of October 23, 2021? Morrison asked. "I was at home doing homework," Noah replied, his voice quiet but steady. "My mom was home, but she'd gone to bed early. My dad was out of town. Brandon was out." "What time did your brother Brandon come home that night?" Morrison continued. "Around 11, Noah said. Maybe a little after. I heard the garage door and heard his car pull in." "Did anything about his arrival home seem unusual to you?" Noah took a deep breath. "Yes. I heard him slamming doors and cursing. He sounded really upset, so I got up from my desk to see if he was okay. What did you observe, Noah? I saw Brandon come in from the garage. He looked really stressed out, like panicked. He went straight back out to the garage and I followed quietly. I watched from the doorway. Morrison displayed photos of the Hayes garage on the courtroom screen. What did you see your brother doing in the garage? He was looking at the front of his car, well, our family's car, the BMW, and I could see that the front end was damaged. The windshield was cracked, the bumper was messed up, there appeared to be blood on the hood and grille. What did Brandon do when he saw this damage? Noah's voice got quieter. He was talking to himself. He said something like, shit, okay, just stay calm. Nobody saw anything. Just clean it up and stick to the story. Then he got cleaning supplies and started cleaning the car, especially where the blood was. How long did you observe this? Maybe 10 or 15 minutes before I went back to my room. I was confused and scared. I didn't understand what had happened. When did you begin to suspect that your brother had been involved in the hit and run that killed Emma Rodriguez? The next day when the news came out, when I heard that someone had been hit on Gulf to Bay Boulevard around 10:45 p.m. and that the driver had fled. And then I thought about Brandon coming home upset around 11, and the damage to the car, and him cleaning blood off it. I knew. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. Morrison then walked Noah through the evidence he had collected: the text messages, the video, the photos. Each piece was entered into evidence and displayed for the jury. The most dramatic moment came when Morrison played the video Noah had recorded of Brandon talking to a friend. The courtroom was silent as Brandon's voice filled the room. Man, I was driving down Gulf to Bay going like 60 because I was late. I didn't see the bike until it was too late. I felt the impact, heard the crunch. I knew it was bad, but I panicked. I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I was fucked. So I just kept going and got out of there before anyone saw. The jury's reaction was visible. Several members visibly recoiled. Others shook their heads. All appeared deeply affected by hearing the defendant admit in his own words that he had struck Emma and fled. Emma's family was crying, with Carlos Rodriguez holding Maria as she sobbed. Brandon sat frozen at the defense table, his face pale, apparently only now realizing how completely his brother's evidence had destroyed his defense. Morrison concluded Noah's direct examination by asking why he had decided to come forward. Noah's response, delivered through tears, captured the moral struggle he had experienced. I didn't want to hurt my family, Noah said, his voice breaking. I love my parents, and I even still love Brandon, even though I hate what he did. But I kept thinking about Emma. I thought about her family and how they didn't have answers. I thought about how Brandon was going to get away with killing someone because I was too scared to speak up. And I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be. I decided that being a good person means telling the truth, even when it costs you everything. Emma's family deserves justice. Emma deserves truth, and I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet and let Brandon avoid responsibility for taking her life. This testimony, delivered by a 15-year-old who had made an agonizing choice to testify against his own brother, was perhaps the most powerful moment of the entire trial. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom, and even some of the bailiffs appeared visibly moved. Defense attorney Webb's cross-examination of Noah was necessarily gentle. Attacking a sympathetic teenager too harshly would alienate the jury. Webb attempted to suggest that Noah might have misunderstood what he saw, that Brandon might have been talking about a different incident, that sibling rivalry might have influenced Noah's interpretation of events. But Noah remained steadfast. "I know what I saw," he said firmly. "I know what I heard. Brandon came home right after Emma was hit. He had blood on the car. He cleaned the car to hide evidence. He admitted to his friend that he hit someone and fled. These are facts, not my interpretation." Webb's cross-examination ultimately strengthened rather than weakened Noah's testimony, as the teenager's consistency and obvious internal struggle made him a highly credible witness. The prosecution rested shortly after Noah's testimony, recognizing that his evidence had provided the conclusive proof they needed. The defense presented a brief case attempting to cast doubt on Noah's reliability, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted decisively. The closing arguments were almost anticlimactic after Noah's testimony. Prosecutor Morrison effectively summarized the overwhelming evidence, both circumstantial and direct, proving Brandon's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Defense attorney Webb made his best effort to suggest reasonable doubt, but his arguments rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. The jury began deliberations on Wednesday afternoon and returned with a verdict after only 4 hours on Thursday morning. The speed of deliberations suggested that Noah's testimony had removed any reasonable doubt. Judge Warren asked the jury foreman if they had reached verdicts. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. "In the matter of State of Florida versus Brandon Hayes, on the charge of vehicular homicide, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." "On the charge of leaving the scene of an accident involving death, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." "On the charge of tampering with evidence, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." Emma's family embraced, crying with relief that justice had finally been achieved. Brandon sat motionless at the defense table, apparently still processing that he had been convicted. His parents were devastated, Jennifer sobbing into Michael's shoulder. Noah sat in the back of the courtroom, looking simultaneously relieved and heartbroken. He had done the right thing, but it had cost him his relationship with his parents and brother, had split his family apart, had transformed him from son and brother into the person who had sent his brother to prison. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for May 2022, 6 weeks after conviction. During those weeks, presentence reports were prepared, victim impact statements were collected, and both prosecution and defense prepared arguments about appropriate punishment. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements from Emma's family and community members. Carlos and Maria Rodriguez spoke about losing their daughter, about the permanent void her death had created, and about their anger that Brandon had shown no remorse until he was caught. "Emma was our light," Maria testified through tears. "She was brilliant and kind and full of dreams for her future. Brandon Hayes took all of that away in a moment of careless driving, and then compounded that tragedy by running away like a coward. For months we had no answers, no justice, no closure. If it wasn't for Noah's courage in coming forward, Brandon would have gotten away with killing our daughter. We will never have Emma back, but at least we have truth and justice, and for that we owe Noah Hayes a debt of gratitude. The defense presented arguments for leniency based on Brandon's age and lack of prior criminal record. However, prosecutors argued that Brandon's behavior, his reckless driving, his decision to flee, his destruction of evidence, his attempts to create false alibis, his arrogant courtroom behavior, demonstrated that he posed a continuing danger and showed no genuine remorse. Judge Warren's sentencing remarks captured the case's significance. Brandon Hayes, you killed Emma Rodriguez through reckless driving. You then made choice after choice that demonstrated consciousness of guilt and complete absence of remorse. You fled the scene rather than render aid. You destroyed evidence. You lied to police. You attempted to create false alibis. And during this trial, you mocked these proceedings and showed contempt for the seriousness of your actions. The only reason you are being held accountable is because your younger brother made the courageous and painful choice to come forward with truth. That says everything about the difference between the two of you. Judge Warren sentenced Brandon to 15 years in prison for vehicular homicide, 5 years for leaving the scene, to run consecutively, and 2 years for tampering with evidence, to run concurrently, for a total of 20 years. With credit for time served and potential good behavior, Brandon would likely serve 16 to 18 years before release eligibility. As Brandon was led from the courtroom to begin serving his sentence, he looked back at Noah one final time. His expression was difficult to read: anger, betrayal, perhaps even a grudging respect for his brother's moral courage. Noah met his gaze briefly before looking away, tears streaming down his face. The aftermath of the case created ripples throughout the Clearwater community and beyond. Noah Hayes became a somewhat reluctant symbol of moral courage, praised by many for choosing truth over family loyalty, while also facing criticism from some who believed family should never testify against family. His relationship with his parents was severely strained, with Michael and Jennifer struggling to accept Noah's decision to testify. In a 2023 interview, Noah reflected on his decision. "I don't regret coming forward, but I won't pretend it didn't cost me everything. My parents barely speak to me. My brother will probably never forgive me. I lost my family for telling the truth. But when I think about Emma's family and what they lost, when I think about Emma herself and the future that was stolen from her, I know I did the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing means losing everything. I just wish it didn't have to be that way." Emma's family maintained contact with Noah, expressing gratitude for his courage and recognizing the sacrifice he had made. Carlos Rodriguez established a relationship with Noah, telling reporters, "Noah gave us justice when his own family tried to hide the truth. He's a remarkable young man who showed more courage and integrity than most adults ever will. We owe him everything." The case prompted important discussions about family loyalty versus moral obligation, about the courage required to speak truth even when it destroys relationships, and about the importance of holding reckless drivers accountable. Emma's death and the trial that followed became a catalyst for stricter enforcement of reckless driving laws in Florida, and for educational programs targeting young drivers about the consequences of inattention and excessive speed. Brandon Hayes, serving his sentence, reportedly struggled to accept responsibility even after conviction. Prison counselors noted that he remained focused on feeling betrayed by his brother rather than on processing the impact of his actions on Emma and her family. Whether he would eventually develop genuine remorse or would spend his incarceration nursing resentment remained to be seen. Noah Hayes, carrying the burden of having testified against his brother, while also carrying the knowledge that he had helped achieve justice for Emma, faced an uncertain future. He continued therapy to process the complex emotions surrounding his decision, continued his education, and worked to build a life defined by his values, rather than by this single traumatic period. The courtroom where Brandon had arrogantly proclaimed there was no evidence against him, only to have his younger brother provide the evidence that convicted him, became the site of one of the most dramatic turnarounds in recent Florida legal history. Brandon's arrogance had been his undoing. If he had shown remorse, if he had taken responsibility, Noah might have found it harder to come forward. But Brandon's cockiness, his contempt for Emma's memory, and his confidence that he would escape justice had pushed Noah to make the hardest choice of his young life. The case ultimately stood as testament to the courage of a teenager who chose principle over family, who accepted the devastating personal cost of truth-telling, and who ensured that Emma Rodriguez's death would not go unanswered. Brandon had believed his brother would never betray family loyalty, had counted on that loyalty to protect his lies. But Noah had shown that true loyalty means loyalty to truth and justice, even when those principles require actions that destroy families and relationships. Emma Rodriguez's memory lived on through her family's advocacy work, through the scholarship established in her name, and through the impact her case had on traffic safety awareness in Florida. Her death, while tragic and preventable, had prompted change that would potentially save other lives. And that change had only been possible because one teenage boy found the courage to speak truth when everyone around him wanted silence.